Hi, I'm going to talk to you about Book 6, which is the first book in which Barnaby Rudge really starts to feel like a historical novel. So let's break down some of that historical context. Book 6 starts with the no Popery cause gaining more and more traction in England, and we see this through a lot of the book's unsavory characters, such as Sim and Dennis the Hangman, joining the fight. And then Book 6 ends with all of this rising action coming to a climactic point, one in which Dickens gives us an exact date, June the 2nd, 1780. So what exactly happened on that day in history? First, let's review just a little bit about the No Popery movement. So you may know some of this, but because the national religion was Protestant in England in the 18th century, there were, believe it or not, a lot of restrictions on what Catholics living in England were and were not allowed to do. And there were a series of laws called the Catholic Relief Acts that were starting to get rid of some of these restrictions. And the Catholic Relief Act of 1778, which we hear Mr. Haredale talking about on page 359, removed the restriction that prevented Catholics from being school teachers. So I'll read that quote to you. Mr. Haredale, who is Catholic, says that Protestants were trying to, quote, prevent our having the surpassing and unheard of privilege of teaching our children to read and write. So Lord George Gordon, who was a member of Parliament and the leader of the Protestant Association of London, was bringing a petition to Parliament to try to repeal that Catholic Relief Act of 1778. And he was bringing that to Parliament on, you guessed it, June 2nd, 1780. And Lord George Gordon was kind of an unhinged religious Puritan who gave these big rousing speeches, and he gathers 50 to 60,000 protesters to join him in the streets of London on this day in which he's presenting the petition. And this is the scene with all of these people filling the streets of London in which Barnaby and his mother arrive in London at the end of Book 6. So the No Popery movement and the Gordon riots were really complex in that, on the one hand, they were this hate-fueled movement centered around anti-Catholic bigotry. But on the other hand, for some people, for people of lower classes who felt ignored by their government, the riots were kind of just a chance for them to show their anger toward the British government, who they felt ignored by. These people were poor and downtrodden. They were mad. They wanted to lash out by storming Parliament and burning prisons to the ground. And that's exactly what they did over the course of these week-long riots. So Book 6 ends with this heart-wrenching scene of Barnaby, the symbol of innocence, getting separated from his mother in this huge crowd of angry protesters. And we see him getting swept away by these unpure forces of greed and money, because if you remember, he's been tricked into thinking that the protesters are going to help him and his mother get rich. And I think Barnaby's innocence just kind of throws into relief the corruptness and vileness of a lot of these protesters. But I think it can also kind of show, it can kind of humanize them a little bit, because maybe a lot of the protesters, like Barnaby, were simply being swept up in the false promise of something better than what they have. So Dickens was fascinated by radicals and rioters, and he writes about them in a number of his novels and considered his own political views to be radical. However, he's also highly critical of violent protests and often uses scenes like the one at the end of Book 6 to warn his readers about the dangers of these types of protests. So as you think about Book 6 and Book 7 as well, I want you to take some time to think about whether you agree with Dickens's characterization of the rioters and what you actually think that characterization is. So historical novels like this one say a lot about a particular historical period. They also say a lot about the time in which the novel was written, but they also go one step further and often kind of have these universal truths about just history and human nature in general. And so I don't want you to hesitate at all to make connections to 21st century protests as well when reading this novel. I think that's exactly what Dickens would have wanted you to do. So I hope you enjoy the rest of the book.